Napoleon Bonaparte entered the Eastern Mediterranean with a confidence that had been earned, not assumed. For years, his campaigns had rewarded speed, boldness, and an instinct for striking before opponents fully understood what threatened them. Egypt was not a reckless adventure in his own mind, but a calculated extension of that pattern. By weakening British influence in the region and opening new routes toward India, he believed he was carrying the war to a place where Britain could be unbalanced, even humbled. Early victories reinforced that belief. Cities fell, armies scattered, and resistance appeared fragmented. Momentum, once established, has a way of shaping decisions, and Napoleon moved eastward, expecting that momentum to continue carrying him forward. The march toward Syria followed that logic. Acre stood on the coast like a locked door, but one that seemed old, poorly maintained, and guarded by unreliable hands. From a distance, it did not look like the kind of obstacle that had stopped European armies before. Napoleon's experience told him that fortresses mattered less when faced with disciplined troops and determined leadership. His assumptions were shaped by years of success against continental powers whose defenses collapsed once pressure was applied in the right place. Acre, in this view, was not a destination, but a delay. Something to be reduced, secured, and then left behind as the campaign moved on. There was also time pressure. The longer the army remained in hostile territory, the more fragile its position became. Supplies had to move over long distances. Disease traveled faster than orders. Allies were uncertain, and local support could never be taken for granted. Speed was not simply a preference, it was a necessity. Napoleon believed that decisive action would shorten exposure to these risks. Acre, therefore, was approached with urgency, but without deep anxiety. It was expected to fall quickly enough to justify the efforts spent against it. This confidence did not come from ignorance. Napoleon understood that the Eastern theater was different from Europe. Roads were poorer, communications slower, and intelligence unreliable. Yet he believed that these disadvantages applied equally to his opponents. His army was experienced, flexible, and accustomed to operating under strain. He trusted his officers to adapt, and he trusted himself to impose direction where uncertainty appeared. The campaign had been planned with care, but it rested on an underlying belief that force of will and clarity of purpose could compensate for imperfect conditions. What remained, largely unexamined, was the sea. Napoleon's victories had been shaped on land, where armies clashed and decisions produced immediate results. Naval power was acknowledged, but often treated as a background condition rather than a decisive variable. The Mediterranean, however, was not neutral space. Control of water meant control of supply, communication, and reinforcement. As the army advanced inland, that distinction mattered more, not less. Yet, from Napoleon's perspective, Acre was still a land problem to be solved by land methods. By the time the French army reached the outskirts of the city, expectation had already shaped behavior. Preparations reflected confidence in eventual success rather than caution against prolonged resistance. The siege began not as a desperate struggle, but as an operation assumed to be temporary. Each day was meant to bring progress, not reconsideration. This mindset, calm and rational on the surface, quietly narrowed the range of responses available when reality began to resist expectation. Acre did not yet feel like a turning point. It felt like a pause. But pauses in war have a habit of stretching, and when they do, assumptions are tested not by theory, but by time itself, in silence alone. Acre was small by European standards, but its value did not lie in size. It lay on a narrow strip of coast where land and sea pressed tightly together, leaving little room for maneuver. Whoever held the port-controlled movement along the eastern Mediterranean shoreline, and whoever controlled that movement shaped every campaign inland. For Napoleon, Acre stood between ambition and continuation. For his opponents, it was a hinge on which larger balances rested. The city's walls were old, yet they were thick, reinforced by generations who understood siege as a recurring fact of life. Acre was not designed to project power outward, but to endure pressure inward. Its defenses faced the sea as much as the land, a detail that mattered greatly in an age when naval guns could speak farther and heavier than field artillery. Geography here was not passive scenery. It dictated options. From the inland approach, Acre appeared constrained, almost compressed by its surroundings. There was no wide hinterland to absorb an attacker's weight. Every trench dug and every gun placed had to fit within narrow limits. This made the city vulnerable in theory, but stubborn in practice. An attacker could not easily spread pressure. Everything converged toward the same confined points where resistance could concentrate. For Napoleon's army, accustomed to movement and decisive engagement, this environment quietly imposed restraint. Siege warfare demanded patience, precision, and time. Time was the one resource the campaign could least afford to lose. Each day spent before Acre was a day exposed to climate, illness, and uncertainty. The city's position ensured that delay was not accidental, but structural. There was also the matter of supply. Acre's port allowed defenders to receive support in ways an inland fortress could not. As long as the sea remained open, food, ammunition, and expertise could arrive despite pressure on the walls. This reality altered the meaning of siege. Starvation and isolation, tools Napoleon relied upon elsewhere, could not be assumed here. Control of land alone was insufficient. Understanding Acre required understanding limits, not possibilities. The city did not offer Napoleon the chance to apply overwhelming force in the manner he preferred. Instead, it narrowed choices and punished impatience. Every advantage depended on coordination beyond the immediate battlefield. This was not yet apparent to the French command in full, but the setting itself was already shaping outcomes. For the listener, Acre begins to emerge not as a backdrop, but as an active participant. Its walls, harbor, and confined approaches quietly influenced decisions before a single major assault unfolded. The city asked a question that Napoleon had not fully confronted, whether speed and confidence were enough when geography itself resisted cooperation. The answer, still incomplete, rested in how long pressure could be sustained. Acre's significance lay in how little room it left for error. Small miscalculations could not be absorbed by distance or retreat. They accumulated instead, pressing inward alongside the walls. This quiet compression of options would soon test assumptions carried from earlier victories. For now, the city waited, doing nothing dramatic, yet steadily asserting its presence through endurance alone. In this stillness, patience favored the defender more than the attacker. Time moved differently for those behind walls than for those exposed beyond them. Acre's geography ensured that waiting was a weapon, one that did not need to strike quickly to be effective. Its power lay in persistence, and persistence, once established, is difficult to dislodge. That quiet advantage would soon demand recognition, not through spectacle, but through the slow realization that progress here would cost far more than expected by those advancing against it. The defense of Acre rested on leadership that understood survival more than glory. Ahmed al-Jazar, the Ottoman governor, was not admired for elegance or reform, but for resilience. His authority came from experience in holding power under pressure, not from winning admiration. He governed through control, discipline, and awareness of threat. For a city exposed to repeated danger, this mindset mattered more than popularity. Acre was not defended by enthusiasm, but by habit. Jazza understood that his position depended on endurance. He had seen how quickly allegiances shifted when weakness appeared. The walls of Acre were therefore not merely stone, they were symbols of continuity. To abandon them prematurely would invite collapse beyond the city itself. This perspective shaped every defensive choice. Risk was measured carefully, not avoided, but never embraced without necessity. Survival, not triumph, was the guiding principle. Ottoman forces within the city were varied in quality and motivation. Some were local troops defending their homes, others were professional soldiers accustomed to garrison duty. Their strength did not lie in maneuver or initiative, but in holding ground. They were not expected to defeat Napoleon in open battle. Their task was simpler and harder at the same time: remain in place. This limited objective aligned with Acre's geography and fortifications. What altered the balance was the presence offshore. British naval officers did not arrive with plans to conquer territory. Their mission was narrower, shaped by a tradition of maritime containment. Britain's power flowed from denying opponents freedom of movement, not from occupying land. Acre offered an opportunity to apply that principle quietly. By supporting the city, British commanders could restrict French options without exposing large forces. The cooperation between Ottoman authority and British naval power was practical rather than ideological. There was little need for shared vision. Each side understood what the other provided. Gaza offered a place to resist. The British offered the means to make that resistance meaningful. Communication was direct, focused on immediate needs rather than abstract strategy. This simplicity reduced friction when complexity could have proved fatal. British officers brought experience from decades of conflict at sea. They understood how shore defenses could be strengthened by naval guns, how supplies could be moved under threat, and how pressure could be maintained without constant engagement. Their presence extended Acre's endurance beyond what land forces alone could achieve. Importantly, this support did not require dramatic confrontation. Its effectiveness grew through repetition and reliability. For Napoleon, this combination was difficult to evaluate from a distance. Neither Gaza nor the British commanders sought decisive action. Their approach was incremental, defensive, and patient. This contrasted with the offensive logic driving the French campaign. While Napoleon measured progress in captured ground, Acre's defenders measured success in days held and assaults repelled. These different measures of success would soon collide. The city's defense was not the product of brilliance, but of alignment. Leadership, geography, and external support reinforced one another. Each element compensated for weaknesses in the others. Together, they formed a system designed not to win quickly, but to resist. For a besieging force under time pressure, this was a quiet but serious problem. As the siege environment settled into place, a shift became clear. The struggle was no longer between attacker and wall alone. It involved contrasting philosophies of war. One sought resolution through momentum, the other relied on endurance and denial. Acre's defenders did not need to outthink Napoleon. They needed only to remain standing long enough for his assumptions to lose their force. In that patience lay a strength often decisive and quietly reshaped the course of events. The opening phase of the siege did not feel like failure. French guns were brought forward, trenches cut into hard ground, and positions established with methodical care. These were familiar routines practiced across Europe with reliable results. The army settled into work rather than combat, confident that persistence would bring progress. Yet from the beginning, time behaved differently here. Each task required more effort than expected, each adjustment took longer, and each delay reduced the margin Napoleon believed he still possessed. Artillery proved a constant frustration. Heavy guns were fewer than planned, and their movement over poor roads consumed strength and patience. When fire began, it lacked the weight required to break walls quickly. Breaches that should have widened remained stubbornly narrow. Repairs by the defenders erased gains made the day before. Nothing collapsed suddenly, but nothing advanced cleanly either. The siege became a contest of accumulation, not momentum. Disease moved quietly through the camps. Heat, poor water, and fatigue weakened men faster than enemy fire. Losses did not arrive in dramatic bursts, but through steady absence. Soldiers reported sick, units thinned, and officers adjusted expectations downward. These losses were not decisive on their own, but they shortened the time available for decisive action. Every illness carried strategic weight, even if it went unspoken. Supply added another layer of pressure. Food, ammunition, and tools arrived irregularly. What reached the army often arrived late or in insufficient quantity. Napoleon had planned for strain, but not for stagnation. The longer the siege continued, the more the campaign depended on systems already stretched thin. Adaptation remained possible, but each solution introduced new complications. Assaults were attempted with determination, but without finality. Troops advanced, suffered losses, and withdrew. Courage was not lacking. What was missing was decisive advantage. Each attack tested defenses without breaking them. The defenders absorbed pressure, adjusted, and endured. This pattern repeated itself, producing effort without resolution. The siege did not drain morale through fear, but through repetition. Within the command, confidence narrowed into resolve. Napoleon did not panic, but options began to feel constrained. Abandoning the siege too early would undermine the campaign's logic. Continuing it risked deeper exhaustion. This tension did not explode into argument. It settled instead into calculation. Every decision carried increasing weight because fewer alternatives remained untouched. The defenders, by contrast, measured success differently. Each failed assault confirmed that endurance was working. Repairs continued. Coordination improved. Waiting proved effective. This asymmetry mattered. The longer nothing decisive happened, the more the balance shifted away from the attacker. Delay itself became an active force. For the listener, the siege at this stage feels suspended. Nothing dramatic resolves the situation. Instead, pressure accumulates quietly. The story invites attention not through spectacle, but through the slow recognition that confidence alone cannot compress time. Acre resists, not by striking back, but by refusing to yield quickly. As days passed, the campaign's rhythm changed. Urgency remained, but certainty weakened. The siege no longer felt like a step forward. It felt like an obligation that demanded fulfillment before movement could resume. That distinction mattered deeply. When progress becomes duty rather than opportunity, energy drains in subtle ways. The army continued its work, but the future narrowed, one careful day at a time. British influence at Acre was felt long before it was fully understood. Ships offshore did not announce themselves with dramatic engagement, yet their presence altered the balance steadily. The sea, which Napoleon had treated as a secondary concern, became an active boundary shaping every decision. As long as British vessels remained in control of the waters, the siege could never be sealed. What appeared to be a local struggle around walls was connected to a wider system that Napoleon could not reach. Naval guns provided a form of strength that land forces could not easily counter. Positioned offshore, they supported the city without exposing crews to the risks faced by infantry. Their fire was measured, not constant, but it was precise enough to matter. French batteries found themselves challenged by weapons they could not silence through conventional means. This imbalance did not produce immediate catastrophe, but it eroded the attacker's advantage day by day. Equally important was the interception of French resources. Siege artillery intended for Acre was captured before it could be used. This single disruption carried long consequences. Without sufficient heavy guns, progress against the walls slowed to a crawl. Napoleon's plans had assumed their arrival. Their absence forced improvisation under pressure, narrowing options further. What had been a temporary inconvenience became a structural limitation. British officers did not seek confrontation for its own sake. Their approach emphasized denial rather than destruction. By keeping supply lines open to the defenders and closed to the attackers, they shaped the tempo of the siege without direct command over it. This indirect influence suited British strategy well. Control was exerted without the need for occupation or large-scale commitment. Acre became a point of leverage rather than a prize. For the defenders, naval support transformed endurance into confidence. Knowing that supplies could arrive and fire support could answer assaults allowed resistance to remain steady. Repairs were made without haste. Decisions could be conservative. The walls did not need to defeat the French outright. They needed only to hold until pressure shifted elsewhere. British guns ensured that waiting remained viable. Napoleon faced a problem that could not be solved by speed or audacity. Naval superiority lay beyond his immediate reach. His army could not force the sea into submission. Each additional day before Acre increased dependence on systems he did not control. This realization did not arrive as a sudden shock. It emerged gradually through repeated frustrations that shared a common source. The siege now revealed its deeper nature. It was no longer a contest between walls and guns alone. It was an encounter between land power and sea power, each operating according to different logics. Napoleon's strength lay in concentration and movement. British strength lay in persistence and reach. Acre sat at the intersection of those forces, benefiting from one while resisting the other. For the listener, this phase brings clarity without resolution. The reasons for delay become visible, but outcomes remain uncertain. British guns do not end the siege decisively. They extend it. That extension, however, is enough. Time, once Napoleon's ally, increasingly works against him. The campaign does not collapse here. It slows, hardens, and narrows. In that narrowing, the weight of maritime power becomes unmistakable, shaping events not through spectacle, but through steady, unavoidable presence. The pressure created by this imbalance was quiet but constant, asking the same question each day about cost and reward. Answers did not come quickly. They accumulated instead, one constrained choice after another, until endurance itself became a calculation rather than a certainty for those pressing the siege. The margin for recovery continued shrinking. Withdrawal did not come suddenly. It emerged as the least damaging option among increasingly limited choices. Napoleon understood that victory was no longer defined by capturing Acre, but by preserving what remained of his army's strength. Each additional day promised diminishing returns. Losses mounted quietly, supplies thinned, and the strategic value of persistence eroded. Continuing the siege risked turning frustration into irreversible damage. Leaving meant accepting that ambition had met a boundary it could not cross. The decision carried weight beyond the immediate campaign. Retreat was not defeat in the traditional sense, but it was an admission that conditions could dictate outcomes as firmly as brilliance. Napoleon ordered the withdrawal with discipline, ensuring that the army moved with order rather than collapse. This restraint mattered. The campaign had not failed entirely, but its eastern horizon had closed. Acre remained standing, not because Napoleon lacked courage, but because his tools no longer matched the problem. The march back through difficult territory reinforced the lesson. The same factors that had slowed progress now pressed harder during retreat. Illness continued. Supplies remained uncertain, yet the army endured, held together by structure and experience. Napoleon's leadership in this phase revealed something different from triumph. It showed control under constraint, an ability to disengage without surrendering authority. This too shaped his reputation, though less visibly than victory. Strategically, the consequences unfolded quietly. British naval power emerged, strengthened, its influence confirmed without dramatic battle. The eastern Mediterranean remained beyond French reach. Ottoman authority, though fragile, had been upheld long enough to matter. Acre's survival did not reshape Europe immediately, but it preserved a balance that Napoleon had hoped to disrupt. The larger war continued, informed by this encounter rather than transformed by it. For Napoleon himself, Acre lingered as a lesson rather than a wound. It revealed the limits of land-based genius when confronted by integrated systems of defense and sea control. His later campaigns would reflect greater awareness of coordination and supply, though not always successfully. Acre did not end his rise, but it reminded him that momentum was not invincible. Geography, time, and opposing structures could resist even the most determined will. The defenders gained no sweeping glory. Their success lay in endurance. By holding, they altered the course of events without pursuing expansion or dominance. This quiet outcome suited their aims. Survival was enough. British involvement remained measured, effective precisely because it avoided excess. The siege ended not with collapse, but with persistence rewarded. For the listener, the story resolves without spectacle. There is no decisive clash, no single moment of reversal. Instead, understanding accumulates. Acre stands as an example of how wars are often shaped not by dramatic victories, but by moments where advance becomes impossible. The withdrawal feels calm, almost inevitable, once its conditions are understood. Napoleon would go on to achieve greater victories and suffer greater defeats. Yet Acre holds a distinct place. It was a moment where ambition met structure and found no passage. British guns did not destroy his army, they denied it resolution. In that denial lay their power. As the campaign faded into history, Acre remained, its walls unchanged by glory, marked instead by endurance. The episode invites reflection rather than excitement. It reminds us that in war, limits often speak more clearly than triumphs. The Eastern defeat did not echo loudly at the time, but its lesson endured. Some obstacles do not fall. They wait, hold, and quietly insist that even the most driven campaigns must eventually turn back.